AskReddit. AskReddit. Taxi, Uber or Lyft drivers have Reddit. What are the most interesting, entertaining or effed up situations that happened to you during the shift? I used to drive Uber at Fort Myers Beach. I picked up 4 drunk as a skunk middle-aged people and crammed them into my tiny car. I was about to pull into their neighborhood, nice, gated, on the water, and the one guy was like, "I need you to follow that car." And I'm like, whatever, let's see how this plays out. So we start following this random SUV, and I'm like, who is this guy? And they're like, we don't know, but we have 20 minutes of babysitter left, and we aren't wasting it. I reminded them they were on triple rate surcharge and they literally didn't care. Eventually the car pulled over and everyone shouts at me, "Go go go," and we sped off into the night. $100 ride, $20 tip, 5-star review, 100% worth it. Entertaining drunk, otherwise responsible people is a blast. I was unemployed at the time. Quit a job due to an abusive/toxic work environment. Had recently graduated a coding boot camp, but wasn't having any luck landing new opportunities. Bills were piling up, and honestly I was losing hope. I'm about to call it a night. Driving drunks around gets tiring, when I decide, hey, what's one more? Turns out these 3 older women wanted to do some gambling in the next state over, and had trouble finding a ride. I said yes, figured I'd just call it a night after. We get talking, turns out one of them is an IT consultant. They decide to pay me basically $100 an hour to hang out till they are done and drive them all home. We ended up connecting. She revised my resume and put me in touch with some references of hers. I ended up making a good buck off the fares alone, and also ended up completely turning my life around while landing a dream job with a little bit of help. I wrote her a sincere thank you once I accepted the new offer, and she replied with, "Help others because you can." Not a day goes by where I don't think about how lucky I am. Back in the 70s as a student I drove a taxi in the weekends and some evenings/nights to earn some extra money. One time, late at night, I got a call to pick a guy up at his home. At arrival the guy hops in the back with a sports bag with few rifles sticking out. I could see that in my rearview mirror. He wanted me to drive out of town to some B road, and in the middle of nowhere he told me to stop the car on a small road in an area with a lot of trees. Hopped out of the car with his bag, came back few minutes later without the bag, and told me to head back to his place and drop him off. He gave me a huge tip, and this is the first time I ever mentioned this happened. Drove for Uber for a bit. Once picked up this guy who ended up being a magician. It's 2 AM. and had to drive him into Manhattan to his apartment. It was weird cause nobody was around. The city was dead quiet for some reason. He sat in the front seat and told me stories the whole ride there. Once there he told me to get out and did a magic trick for me. He made 4 $100 bills turn into $4 bills and gave me it for a tip. I drove for Uber and Lyft for a short time. There was one situation I will never forget. I was driving downtown DSM and picked up a gentleman who was just getting out of the Cubs game. He was loaded down with Cubs gear, he told me about $400 worth, and was absolutely trashed from drinking all day at the game. The first thing he says when he gets in is, "I know my destination is X, but I need to go to my hotel first to put all this stuff away." I say, "No problem," and he lets me know how appreciative he is, and he will make it worth my time. I honestly didn't mind waiting, because the ride was still active, so I was still making money. He gets back in the car and we start heading toward his original destination, about 30 minutes away. We get to talking, and apparently he is a beverage distributor for a company in CA. He is doing some sales in the area, and asks me if I like to drink. I told him I do on occasion, to which he replies, "Do you like vodka?" and passes a full bottle of vodka to me in the driver's seat. It was sealed, thank God. He told me it was a new kind of vodka that he was trying to get on the shelves of some local bars, because this vodka was originally created by some ISU students. When we arrived at the destination, he thanked me again for going out of my way to drop him off, and let me keep the bottle as a tip. Definitely one to remember. The first that comes to mind was a 78-year-old lady that insisted that I needed to know about the hookup she was going home from. She went into descriptive detail about her sexual life. When she realized that I wasn't into that conversation, she decided that talking about Trump was the next best thing. The other was a guy that I picked up at about 5 PM on a Wednesday. This dude was probably the most drunk person I have ever met. He kept calling me smart guy and asking me if I spoke French and German. When I told him no, he insisted that I did and called me a liar. I had to ask him if he wanted to take the tollway, and he said it was up to me since I was the smart guy. I ended up taking the tollway and he yelled at me asking why I went that way. I ended up basically giving him two options: get out of the car on the tollway or shut the f up. When I dropped him off, it took him 10 minutes to get out of the car. His house was right before a cul-de-sac, so when I came back around he was standing in the road, so I couldn't pass. Dude was a psycho. The last Uber rider I ever picked up was a teenage kid, maybe 16ish, and what I would assume was his girlfriend. They got in the backseat, and after a few minutes started to hear some unsettling sounds. Look back and she is straight up blowing him in my backseat. It was like 3 in the afternoon and I picked them up from the mall. Who does that? I usually do the late night because that's when I feel the passengers a little looser in personality. I picked up this woman from a bar. She is obviously too drunk to stand on her own. So a man as she was all over helped her get into my backseat and sent me on my way. In my head, I was thinking he's gonna get a second date. I noticed that her destination was 45 minutes away from where I picked her up. So my assumption that it was a work outing or whatever. Next thing I know, her phone rings. She picks up and says, "Hey honey, the Uber is bringing me home." Hangs up and says to me, "Man, my husband is so annoying asking why I'm out so late." Turns out she was having an affair with the previous guy that helped her in my backseat. But that's not the crazy part. She starts complaining she has to pee. I told her I can't pull over for her to pee since we are on a highway. She starts crying and begging, and I finally give in because I didn't want piss in my car. So I pull over, she gets out and starts peeing. Next thing I know, the door opens. She still has her pants down to her ankles and just climbs back into my car and falls asleep. At this point I'm freaking out because she can blame me for anything at this point. So we are 10 minutes from her house and she wakes up finally. She realizes the state she is in and immediately apologizes to me. But before she pulls up her pants she says to me, "You like what you saw?" and pulled her pants up and went to her husband. I got 5 stars and a $5 tip for that. Not me, but my mom. She was delivering Uber Eats last winter to some guy a little out of town. The location was a bit odd, but she went with it. Just outside our city on one of the side roads by some train tracks, she parked her car and looked around for any houses. None. There was a train stop nearby and suddenly my mom noticed a guy waddling through the deep snow towards her. "Are you? Let's call him Bob." "Bob." He nodded, took the food, and waddled towards the train. Suddenly it starts up and continues down the tracks. This guy dead ass ordered Uber Eats while conducting a train. Picked a guy up from a strip club around 5 PM. He had clearly been there for a while and was talkative drunk. He started talking to a friend on his phone and kept saying he couldn't go into detail because he had a lady driver. He told me he was going home and then taking his daughter out to a basketball game because there was a after game concert she was very excited about. Little did he know, or I know, because I was just following the GPS, that he had been routed to her high school. Dude's in a rumpled suit, smells like strip club, and is clearly not sober. He got a resolved look, handed me a few singles, said thanks for the ride boo, and just hitched up his pants like a man embracing his shitty situation. I was driving on Halloween in a relatively small coastal city and had to pick up a couple from a local hotel. The woman was dressed in a long button-down jacket that was tightly closed, fishnet pantyhose, and stilettos. Dude was dressed in sweatpants and was also in a buttoned-up long coat, but I could see something black and shiny around both of his wrists and at his collar. It was around 76 degrees out, so I knew they weren't dressed for the weather. I thought, okay, maybe just a weird Halloween couple's costume, it's fine. I picked them up and made small talk as I drove them to an industrial complex in a small community just outside of the city. They were traveling here from Florida and just meeting up with some friends for a Halloween party. Only thing super weird about them so far was their clothing choices. We pull up to the drop-off location and it's a small strip mall with doctors' offices and small businesses. But at the end, there's a door with a bright red heart symbol with a devil's tail. I then noticed the other people getting out of cars and walking up. Most of the women were dressed as slutty nuns, teachers, librarians, pretty much every fetish you can name. Some of the men were in leather assless chaps, a gym suit, and one dude was already stripping buck naked in the parking lot. The couple grinned at me, tossed me a $20 tip, and pretty much ran in the building. 99% certain dude was wearing a leather bodysuit and woman wasn't wearing much of anything. That was my first time delivering people to the local swingers club. Now, I pretty much have their schedule memorized and try to be on the other side of town when the events end. I picked up a guy who either refused to pay a hooker from the night before or didn't know she was a lady of the night. She proceeded to follow us. Finally he gets a call from someone. Seemed like it scared him because he told me to bring him back to his place. She followed us back there. I promptly left. Probably should have kicked him out sooner. I picked up 4 guys wearing neon green tutus. The guy in the front seat looks at me while I'm driving and says, "Don't do drugs." Then proceeds to snort Coca-Cola from some sort of vial. I smiled and said, "Please don't do drugs in my car." I drove a taxi in a suburb of Boston for a while in the 80s. One day, a kid in his 20s with a baseball bat hailed me and asked me to take him to a pharmacy nearby. It was the middle of the day, so I assumed he was coming from softball practice. He told me to wait. Then he went into the pharmacy and left the bat in the car. A minute or two later, he came running out of the pharmacy with the pharmacist right behind him. Was this guy nuts? What kind of criminal uses a cab as a getaway car? I casually reached back and locked the door. Just as he reached the cab, he fumbled with the handle, realizing that he left his only defensive weapon inside, and then ran off. I let the pharmacist into the cab and then the two of us made a slow pursuit of the guy while reporting his location over the radio. No cell phones. Eventually, he was so exhausted that I got out of the cab and held him until the police arrived. I had to testify in court and identify him. Not the sharpest tool in the shed. Drove Lyft for about a month a few years back and hated it. Had a pickup near the Flatiron building for a woman. Get to the location and she's nowhere to be found. Calls me and tells me that she's on her way. A few minutes later, she shows up with some guy. Says she'll be right with me. They're both obviously hammered and start making out right outside the car. I don't get much of a look at her, but she's petite and blonde with a pixie haircut. She gets in the car and it turns out she's going to Hoboken. Asks me to turn on the radio to a top 40 station. She starts singing along. We end up chatting. She's really excited about the new Taylor Swift album that's coming out any day now. We keep talking, and it's friendly and a little flirty. She leans forward and starts ruffling my hair with her hands. At some point, she sits back, and we stop talking. The music is still playing. I start to hear her making quiet moaning noises. Look in the rearview mirror, and it turns out that she's definitely pleasuring herself. This goes on for a long time. At no point during it does she acknowledge my presence in any way. After we get to Hoboken, she becomes a little talkative again. Tells me that she wants me to drop her off at a nearby bar instead of where she lives. When we arrive at the bar, she hops out of the car without saying anything, and I watch her go inside.